Hello, and welcome to the presentation, Genealogy and the Gilded Age. Did your great granddaddy own or work on the railroad? This meeting is from the International Institute of Genealogical Studies. This virtual meeting is part of our American Record Certificate program, and you can learn more about the Institute at genealogicalstudies.com. So, tonight, the goal of the presentation is to talk about some tips, tricks, and resources to research your Gilded Age ancestors. First, we're going to talk about the history of the Gilded Age and what records were created. Then we're going to do a deep dive into census research. Then we're going to talk about the substitutes for the 1890 census. And then we're going to talk about these substitutes, which are the state censuses, the New York 1890 police census, and city directories. And then we're going to talk a little bit about newspaper research for the different communities of the Gilded Age. Now, during the lecture, I'm going to be speaking about different courses that the International Institute of Genealogical Study has. But I'm only going to be able to mention a few. We really have over 240 online self-paced courses that can help you trace your family history from around the world. So if you don't hear a course or or something relevant to your ancestors mentioned, we probably still have that course, so you can check out the catalog at genealogicalstudies.com. So, what and when was the Gilded Age? So, in the United States history, the Gilded Age is from the late 1870s to the late 1890s. It was named by 1920s historians after Mark Twain's 1873 novel, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. So now, as far as the history, we're beginning to think about where do your ancestors fit in? It was a time of rapid economic growth, especially in the northern and western United States. And now, American wages during this time grew much higher than wages in Europe. And the increasing industrialization meant that we needed in America a more skilled labor force. So millions of European immigrants came to America. Now, pre-1880, most of the immigrants were from Germany, Britain, Ireland, and Scandinavia. Post-1880, we began to have more immigrants. They call this the Great Migration. Poland, Austria, Hungary, Greece, Eastern European Jews. And in the West, there were Chinese immigrants. And the South still remained economically devastated after the American Civil War, and it was very much dependent on the crops of cotton and tobacco, which were low priced at that time. So a little bit more history. Now, with the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and the rise of Jim Crow laws, African American people in the South were stripped of political power and voting rights and were left economically disadvantaged. Railroads were the major growth industry with factories, oil, mining, and finance. And also at this time, there was the growth of social causes, labor unions, women's suffrage, the temperance movement, African American civil rights advocacy, the settlement house, which gave classes to immigrants, the social reform movement, and the North and Western states were building public elementary schools, and public high schools started to emerge, even though high school education was not compulsory at that time. So this is the beauty of genealogy, because you begin to try to figure out where do your ancestors fit in history, and where they fit in the puzzle brings more meanings to their lives and to the traditions and stories that they brought down to you. So, in looking at history through the lens of genealogy, we ask ourselves what records were created by this history. So, the Golden Age, you have immigration and naturalization, passengerless. Now, Ellis Island didn't start until 1892. So before that, ships came into the Castle Garden port of New York. And, there's naturalization documents. There's the federal and state censuses we're going to talk about. Occupation and labor documents. For example, labor union membership cards, mining claim registers, sharecropping contracts. Other things, public education. Now there's school records, African American history, there's Freedmen Bureau records, land and property records, patent records with all the inventions from this time, deeds, the social and reform movements, petitions, temperance pledge cards, settlement house registers of people who lived there. And also all of this created newspapers and newspaper articles your relatives could be in, which is something we're going to speak about. So, when we think of the Gilded Age, and I must admit I'm a big fan of the TV show, we talk about Mrs. Astor's 400 families. The 400 was a list of New York society during the Gilded Age. It was led by Caroline Schimmerhorn Astor, Mrs. Astor. After her death, it was filled by three women, her position, Mamie Fish, Teresa Fair Ulrich, and Alva Vanderbilt Belmont. Now, Alva Vanderbilt, that was her first marriage, and she divorced her husband, quite the society scandal, and she became Mrs. Belmont. And we're going to talk about the Vanderbilts. So, the Gilded Age. Now, old money literally was the age of their fortunes. To be old money in the Gilded Age in one of the 400, you had to have had a fortune for at least three generations. Many of them were colonial Dutch Knickerbocker lines. These were people who came to the New World, America, when New York was still called New Netherlands. New York did not become British until 1674. Now, some of the well-known families are the Drexels, the Schermerhorns, which was Mrs. Astor's maiden name, and the Livingston families. Now, the Livingstons are a very interesting family because in addition to being, old New York Knickerbockers, they married with Mayflower descendants. They have Revolutionary War members of the family. They're very prominent married with colonial American families. Some of the Gilded Age, they had ancestors who signed the Declaration of Independence. Now, new money was were people who made their fortune within the current generation or the last generation at that time. But it doesn't mean that these families were not early American settlers, which I found very interesting. Some of the families of the new money, they made their fortune late, but they'd also been in America, New York area, since Dutch colonial times. In fact, the Vanderbilts, they are from an old Dutch family on Staten Island, but they were not from the elite Knickerbocker families. Now, what's interesting also is Cornelius Vanderbilt, and this is his home, the Breakers on Newport, Rhode Island. He did make the list of the 400. So there were a few new money families on the list. Something also interesting is Christine Baranski, who's on the show The Gilded Age. One of the reasons she wanted to do the show was her husband, Matthew Collis, who passed away. He was an actor. He himself is a descendant of the Drexels, and we're going to talk a little bit about them also. Okay, now, when we say the Mayflower, you might be wondering, did my ancestors come on the Mayflower? And you might be surprised, according to the General Society of Mayflower Descendants, there may be as many as 35 million living descendants of the Mayflower passengers and crew worldwide, and 10 million living descendants in the United States, which is 3% of the United States population in 2018. So that is about 3 out of 100 people may have Mayflower ancestors. Now, we have two courses. One is Research Mayflower Ancestors, and another is Research Colonial New England Ancestors. And it's very worthwhile if you're going to take those courses to find if you have Mayflower ancestors, because those courses can also help you prepare your application to prove your lineage to join the General Society of Mayflower Descendants. So, and something else is the Mayflower descendants, they cross all areas of society. Now, John Adams, the second president of the United States, is a Mayflower descendant. Marilyn Monroe is a Mayflower descendant. Amelia Earhart is a Mayflower descendant. Meryl Streep, whose daughter Louisa Jacobson is also on the Gilded Age, they're Mayflower descendants. So this Family Search has a site where you can do Mayflower research, and also this site, an American Ancestors lists famous descendants. And what's so interesting is if you can prove your Mayflower descendancy, often you can see how you're related to the other Mayflower descendants. So you may find out you're an eighth cousin to Marilyn Monroe, or, a 15th cousin to Amelia Earhart. So let's talk a little bit more about the genealogy of the Gilded Age. Now, there were two federal censuses taken during the Gilded Age, the 1880 and the 1890. Now, the United States Census is the federal census, all the states. It is mandated by the Constitution, an enumeration, a population census every 10 years. And it just describes things like representation in the House of Representatives. And it's been going on because it's based on population. It's been going on from 1790 until the present. Now, the individual name records are locked for 72 years. So, for example, the most recent census, the 1950 census, is the one that was most recently made available in 2022. And in 1960, the next one will be released in the year 2032. So we still have a little bit more time. So the 1880 federal census. Now, one of the tips I can give you is when you're going to search, if you're looking for your family on a specific record, instead of going to Family Search and Ancestry and putting in your ancestor's name, you should search by collection. For example, Family Search has an 1880 federal census collection. You can find it on the Family Search website in the catalog, or you can just put in Google 1880 federal census and you get to the collection page. Now, another thing which I recommend you do, besides searching from the collection page for your ancestor when you can, when it's indexed by name, is knowing what the document contains before you begin the search. So, for example, the 1880 census, it listed everyone in the household, it listed occupation, it listed health, if someone was disabled, blind, deaf, it listed education if they were literate. And now, if you see here, it also lists the birthplace of the person in the census and the birthplace of their mother and father. Now, it gives the birthplace, but it doesn't give anything about citizenship, which is on later censuses. Later censuses say if someone was a citizen, if they were an alien, if they filed papers. So it's wonderful to know what is in the records because you can see what you're looking for. And for example, if you're looking for an ancestors where their parents were born, the 1880 census can help you with that. But if you're looking for naturalization, you'll have to look on a later census. Now, so we're talking right now about the first census of the Gilded Age, the 1880 federal census. Now, I chose to look for the Vanderbilts. Here we have Alva. This is a picture of Alva in 1883, and which was taken at her famous ball, which was 3 years after the 1880. Here we have her daughter Consuela. Now, Consuela was only 3 years old on the 1880 census, but as many of you know, she will be basically sold into marriage to the Duke of Marlborough, and she will become the Duchess of Marlborough. So it's very interesting. Now, one of the things I love about the 1880 census and the Vanderbilts is you can see under profession, we have Alva, she's 27, Consuelo's 3, and William Vanderbilt, their father and husband, under profession, it actually said Railroad King. I guess Railroad Daddy wasn't an option then, but it said Railroad King, so I gave him a crown, which I thought was very interesting. That's how they choose to officially describe him. And now they're on the census for Oakdale and Islip, which is Suffolk County, New York, and it's their house called Idle Hours. This is the house. And something else about the census, and this is we're talking about figuring out where your ancestor fits in history, is what was their occupation. Now, if your ancestor was in service, and whatever their occupation was, it will be on the census. Now, for example, and this is what these they had about 2 pages of their household from the Vanderbilts in 1880. So, for example, Eileen Traynor, she was the laundress. She was born in Ireland, as were her parents. You can see the groom, his wife, he was also born in Ireland, but his wife was born in France, as were her parents. The coachman was British. He and his parents were born in England. Now, so the next census is the 1890, and unfortunately, a fire in 1921 destroyed 99% of the census schedules. So out of the 63 million entries of people, only 6,160 survived. And this is most important tip I can give you when you're doing any genealogical research. Research the collection and see what still exists. Now, you could think of it as the big five. Who should be in it? Who compiled it? Because if someone you think should be there is missing, maybe they died before. Who compiled it? That's very important. For example, in what a lot of people don't know, the census papers are people who are hired to take the census. Now, if you look at the name of the person, and let's say his name was John Smith, and your family, you can see on the census, their native language was Italian, he may not have spoken Italian. So understanding who compiled it may be why there's errors. What data should be there? And that we talked about earlier. On a census, it could be how much money they made on later censuses, immigration. So that can give you more information to research. Also, a census, now it's very interesting. Most censuses were compiled as of the date, let's say June 1st, 1880. So even if the census, let's say the census was as of June 1st, 1880, your great grandfather, he died June 9th, 1880. The census taker came June 11th, 1880. Your grandfather will still be on this, great grandfather will still be on the census because it's June 1st. So knowing when and where it and when it was compiled is very important because you can see family members who are being added or subtracted. You can be a trick to search for them. How was it compiled? Because a lot of the censuses, an original was made and then a handwritten copy was made. And there are a lot of mistakes in the copy. So you have to see what you have. So any research you're going to do, and we're going to see with the 1890 census and the substitute, it's very important understanding more about the collection. Now, the 1890, what survived, and this is from the Institute course AM 101, American Census Records. And as you can see, not much did survive. Now, in New York, it's a few counties per state. Now, in New York, it's Suffolk County, Brookhaven Township, New York, Westchester County. And I didn't think any of the Vanderbilts were there, even though I did a search. What else survived in the 1890s? If you live in Texas, there is a few more counties, but as you can see, very little survived. Now, so if you'd like to do an 1890 federal census, this is a prime example of before you take the time to do the search, you need to figure out if your ancestors are in one of these places. If not, it doesn't make sense to do it. You save yourself time. But if they do happen to be in one of these places, then you're lucky. Now, on the 1880, they were in a different township in Suffolk County, so the Vanderbilts are not on this census. Now, what do you do? Because 1890, you have to find your ancestors. Now, for any census, it's the state censuses that are wonderful substitutes. Now, the state censuses were most common from the 1800s to the 1900s, and they're often conducted in years ending in 1885, 1895, 1905. Now, the thing is this, survival of the records is uneven. Some years are missing or lost, and some states never took censuses at all. So this, again, before you want to start researching your ancestors, find out where they are, and you could just even put into Google Rhode Island state censuses, Rhode Island Census 1905 to see where it is, to see what exists. You can also find in the Family Search Wiki. Now, there is an 1892 New York State Census, but Manhattan didn't survive. So we're going to talk in a second about what you can do if your family's from Manhattan. But this was very interesting. This is the 1915 Rhode Island Census. And as you can see, this is Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt. She was a widow by this time. This is Alva's husband's relatives' family. And this is the Breakers, which is their very famous mansion in Newport. And what's interesting, you can see here, above it is her staff. Here, it says she has her own income. And we mentioned the Drexels earlier. She lives near the Drexels. I doubt they're actual next door neighbors with all this land. And you could see this is the Drexel family. And for example, this is his servant, his private secretary. Now, if your ancestors are from Manhattan, the best replacement for the 1890 federal census is the 1890 New York Police Census. Why was it taken? And this just kind of shows you about records. It was taken because the 1890 census, the powers that be in New York disagreed. Because at that time, it was Manhattan, part of the Bronx. The federal census counted 1,515,301 people, and New York felt they were undercounted. So they had its police department carry out its own census, and they did find 1,710,715 people. So apparently, in the 1890 census, 200,000 people were missing. Now, the New York City Public Library has a very nice guide to the census before you do research, and it also has a blog post about called the Manhattan Mistabulation, the story of the 1890 police census, and that is a wonderful article about it. So, the census was 1,000 volumes, but and it can now about 100 of those volumes are lost. So there's only 894 volumes, but it still has 1.5 million names. Now, and there's something else you have to remember. New York City at that time was Manhattan plus part of the Bronx, but not the eastern part of the Bronx that was annexed in 1895. But Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island didn't become boroughs of the city until 1898. So they're not in the census, but the 1.5 million people in Manhattan are. And there's one other very exciting purpose for the 1890 police census. They are substitutes for birth records because 15 to 25% of births to Irish, Italian, Jewish, and other immigrant families were not reported to any civil office. No, other words, no birth certificates. So the 1890 census can be used to identify their names and approximate dates of birth of children whose families, because they were immigrants, may have never registered them. Now, searching the 1890 police census. Ancestry, it's digitized. You can search by name. You can put in your ancestor's name. But the problem is you can see they only have 30 volumes in Ancestry digitized. And as we learn, there's more than 894 volumes existing. So if you put in the name of an ancestor who's not in one of the volumes that Ancestry has, you'll come up with nothing when in fact they could be on the census. It's not an Ancestry. So what do you do? Family Search has an index to the 1890 census. You can search by name. So for example, I went to Family Search, I searched the index collection, I found Alva Vanderbilt in volume number 737. So you take the volume number, you go to the website of the New York City Department of Records and Information Services, 1890 Police Census, and on the top you see a box that says Search Within. You put in the volume number, and then you get the volume. Now, the volume was about 118 pages. I used a city directory, which I'll explain in a moment, to find the address of the Vanderbilts, which was 660 Fifth Avenue. And based on, within the volume 737, I found Fifth Avenue and then I found the number. So it didn't take nearly as long as it would take, if it was, even though it was unindexed. And you could see here we have William Vanderbilt, Alva, we have Consuelo, who is now 13, William, he was 1, he's now 11, and we have Harold, who's only 7. So this is a wonderful record to find your ancestors in Manhattan in 1890, since the 1890 census burned up. Now, this is now another wonderful census substitute. And if you're going to search, look for the volumes of the 1890 police census, knowing the address helps. Now, the New York Public Library has an extensive collection online of city directories. They're from 1786 through 1935. And after that date, telephone directories were printed. And the city directories, since so many were printed, they were mass produced, many do survive. So it's not only for city directories for New York, you can find them at various places for your city. You can start by checking a local library. You can start by checking the historical society for your area. You can check to see where it is, and then if you can find your ancestors if they had a business. You can find who lived in a house. Sometimes you could find their address, as I said, to look at the 1890 police census or to search a census by enumeration district. Now, so I did go to Family Search, and Family Search also has the United States City and Business Directories collection, and you can search by name. So I put in William K. Vanderbilt. At this time, our railroad king was now in charge at Grand Central Station, and it gave the address 665th Avenue, and I took that address, and when I looked in the volume for New York Police Census, it made it much easier to find them. It was very quick. So that is another wonderful thing about the Gilded Age is with newspapers. Now, and a wonderful free site is the Library of Congress chronicling America, and this is the guide to the collection. Now, something else that we have to remember about this time, our ancestors lived in very, very tight-knit communities, often from where they came. Irish lived in one part of their city, German lived in another part of the city, Jews lived in another part of the city, and since they often didn't speak the language English, or they weren't necessarily part of the wider community, they often had their own community newspapers and their languages. So when you're searching Library of Congress, you can search different ethnicities to see what newspapers they have, which is a very good way to search. Now, one of the ways to search, they give you the African American ethnicity, and they have many, many African American newspapers. And what I thought was very interesting, they have the New York Age, which is a newspaper from Timothy Thomas Fortune, who was also talked about on the show The Gilded Age. So newspaper research is a wonderful avenue for your ancestors, whether they had a business, whether they have an obituary, a classified ad, or whether they're mentioned in an article, even as a bystander. So that also is another wonderful way you can find your ancestors if the 1890 census is missing. Perhaps in the 1890 census, you'll find the ad for your great-grandfather's stable or haberdashery business. Now, if you're looking for Jewish ancestors, the National Library of Israel has the Historical Jewish Press Database. You can see it here at this website. It's searchable by name, and they have newspapers from all over the world in many languages. And for example, one newspaper they have is the Forwitz, which is the Yiddish word, the forward. It's still known as the Jewish Daily Forward. So if you're searching Manhattan in these times, this is a wonderful database to search and one of the many newspapers to search for your ancestors. Now, if you'd like to continue this discussion about Gilded Age ancestors searching, finding. If you go to the website genealogysocial.com, formerly genealogywise.com, Genealogy Social is a social network site for genealogy connected to the International Institute of Genealogical Studies. You can sign up for a free account, then join the Gilded Age genealogy group, where there'll be forums and blog posts and things and resources to further research your Gilded Age family. And I very much hope you will join. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. And I invite you to learn more about the International Institute of Genealogical Studies at genealogicalstudies.com.